So I'm experimenting with a couple different formats for videos going forward, and I wanted to try something where I pick a particular album that I'm very fond of and go into it in more depth than I usually do for a single album. Ideally, this would be something that's a bit overlooked, or, something that would be, I think, of interest to fans of the channel, but which might be in a vein that they normally wouldn't check out. And today I want to talk about the fourth Procol Harum album, Home. I'll start by admitting here that I didn't really pay much attention to Procol Harum until a few years ago. I'd always considered them to be more of a proto-prog band than a full-fledged progressive rock band. And I mean, that is probably an accurate opinion, though I'm really not usually that interested in the question of whether something is this genre or that genre or whatever. But, even for a band with the occasional 20-minute suite or symphonic overlay, it still seems to me like they're doing something categorically different from Yes or Emerson, Lake and Palmer. But if you look at the Venn diagrams of Procol Harum fans and fans of more conventional progressive rock, those circles, I would imagine, do overlap almost entirely. Now, when I started working through their catalog a few years ago, I wasn't sure when I began if they'd really have really any great songs beyond A Wider Shade of Pale. Dumb as that feels to say now, because actually they've got a really remarkable catalog of work. And as I moved forward, I just kept being surprised by the quality and depth of what they did, and maybe even got more impressed as I moved on from that first album. And their fourth album, Home, is really where it sank in, to me at least, how interesting these guys are. Now, I don't hear Home talked about much, really at all, even when I do hear Procol Harum talked about. And it doesn't really have any kind of landmark pieces that you tend to hear referenced as frequently as something like, Conquistador or In Hell 'Twas I. But what sets it apart for me is how remarkably dark and dramatic it is. This is an album that is just saturated with images of death, of retribution, of apocalypse, of the skies opening up and raining fire. It's gothic in the sense that that word had before it was a subgenre. And it's over-the-top morbid a lot of the time, in a way that would be maybe even a bit comical if they weren't good enough to pull it off as effectively as they do. And it's especially interesting because you would never know any of that from the cover, which is a board game parody that suggests something kind of lighthearted and goofy, right? That misdirection continues with the opening track, Whiskey Train, which is, it's a nice enough piece of blues rock, but it feels like it was pulled from a totally different universe than everything else here. Both of these decisions are very odd. It's like they're trying to kind of almost hide the true nature of this thing from anybody who's not going to pay careful attention. But it's the next track, Dead Man's Dream, which is where the mood changes and the real vibe of the album emerges. The narrator gives us a dying vision of wandering with a stranger through a ruined city. And the song starts as a piano ballad, but the music and the delivery build in intensity as nightmarish imagery piles up. Let me play you a clip here.
The corpses were rotten, yet each one was living. Their eyes were alive, with maggots crawling.
And even though he wakes from the dream, that title leaves the ominous suggestion that waking ultimately is not salvation. So Dead Man's Dream has this dark, nightmarish lyric over this very cinematic musical setting. The combination makes natural sense. We get a much stranger effect with the song Still There'll Be More, which mostly sounds like a reasonably straightforward rock song, except that the lyrics are an endless catalog of all the vengeances that the narrator is going to wreak upon the listener. Some of those vengeances are great, some are small, but none of them are really going to end in mercy for the subject or satisfaction for the revenant. And some of these lyrics, I kind of even really can't imagine somebody trying to pull off today outside of, a subgenre like death metal or black metal or a very extreme form of hip hop maybe. It's hilarious to me that their anthology is named after this track, which includes lyrics like, I'll kidnap your wife, savage or senseless. I assume this means rape. and burn out her eyes. So it's legitimately shocking in a way that is kind of surprising today. And it's amusing partly because there's no indication at all of, whatever might have been done to cause this level of anger. You can read any number of possibilities into it, I suppose, but the surface level text doesn't have anything in it but that one-dimensional aggression. It reminds me actually a little bit of the Blue Oyster Cult song Career of Evil, except that song is arch and comical, and this is really a pretty nasty bit of business. Now, there's another change of tone here into the song Nothing That I Didn't Know. We go from this bizarre, intense, violent, vengeful song to this passionate dirge for a dead young woman, which is moving in this very raw, plain-spoken way. Just a complete 180, other than in terms of the continuing darkness and the kind of really bleak thematic fixations. It ends with this just despairing sequence where there's this kind of bleak acoustic chord and a descending chromatic scale on what I think is an accordion. Have a listen. And the next track here, I said at the beginning of this video that the morbid lyrical preoccupations here could almost start to register as comical if the overall album weren't so well done, right? And this next track, we have a song called Dead Man's Dream, followed by a Requiem for a Dead Woman, and then that's followed with a song called About to Die, right? So that's where kind of that pile up of bleakness and death fixation really kind of hits almost a sort of escape velocity, right? What I really love on this piece is the climactic build into the chorus. Take a listen.
Light a candle up in kingdom come. Light the way for the Savior's son. A candle burning bright enough to tell the city down.
Now, there's almost kind of a humorous trick that happens here, which is that the next couple of songs seem from the titles like they would be a total change of pace. The next one up is called Barnyard Story, which is, not the most appealing song title. But despite being a relatively mellow, short ballad, Barnyard Story actually ties together a lot of the sort of dark lyrical threads that we've been working with up to this point. You have lyrics about growing old with sorrow, growing fat with sin, I was living in a graveyard, heavens opened wide and I beheld a flaming chariot. There's a lyrical juxtaposition of images of apocalypse and revelation on the one hand with images of aging and melancholy. And, that combination, that interplay is mirrored in the interplay between the two main instrumental elements, as in this clip.
I saw a sacred bride. Now and then.
There's an effect there where the piano seems to represent the quotidian, the daily, and the organ represents the sacred, right? The transcendent. And it rises up in this kind of overwhelming way, but then sinks back into the doldrums. And the next track, somewhat humorously titled Piggy Pig Pig, once again seems from the title like it would be something more comical, but we have the same images of fiery apocalypse, right? Streets are washed with blood and pus. Gods aloft, the winds are raging. Now, the song Wailing Stories is the epic of the album, seems to be the one that people talk about the most. Once again, you have those same images, right, of lightning, fire, brimstone, boiling oil, shrieking sea. In this context, those are placed in what seems to be an adaptation of Moby Dick, though I might be reading too specific a comparison there. Honestly, for me, the period piece qualities in this track kind of water down the lyrical effect relative to some of the others. It's a great piece in terms of composition. It's got a very impressive build and climax, but because everything is put in this 19th century frame, because it does have these kind of Moby Dick vibes, it feels explicitly signposted as kind of being about a character. Doesn't necessarily have the impact of some of the other songs where, they might be musically more low key or more conventional, but they feel intimate and visceral because of the dark energy in the lyrics. This one feels a bit more like watching a movie in a way. It's a lovely song, great musical climax, but it's not disturbing the way that some of the others are. It is maybe a good way of kind of transitioning out of those themes, putting some distance between those themes and the listener. And the final song, Make Your Own Choice, is weirdly good natured and cheerful relative to everything else on the album. I think it makes a fascinating bookend with Whiskey Train in terms of, these very incongruous, very unrepresentative tracks that sit at each end of what's overall this very condensed black kind of slab of meanness and apocalypse and darkness. So that's been my discussion of Home by Procol Harum. If you like songs like Whiter Shade of Pale or Conquistador, but you've never heard this album, I think it's a really fascinating piece of work. If you do know this album, feel free to give me your thoughts on it in the comments. Thanks much for your attention, and I'll see everybody next week.